Now, Pera, you're in a very unique position. You have contact with the diplomats at the United Nations. You see the 192 ambassadors. You have contact with the people, the UN employees who work in the various agencies, but you also have contact with people, just folks who are out in over 100 countries, and you get feedback from all of them. Now, is there some way that you can channel the recommendations or perhaps policy recommendations from people in various countries back into the United Nations system? Do you share your ideas with the diplomats here, with the folks who head up perhaps UNESCO, the UN Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, or the UN Environment Program, or whatever it might be? You try to bring that information back to funnel it into the system?
Well, your program's called Global Connections. We have a monthly newsletter called UN Connections.
Perfect.
And I actually do think that the business that I'm in is connectivity. It's making the connections at all sorts of levels between people in the UN system. And I'd encourage your viewers to subscribe to UN Connections. They can do so on our website.
And that's by going to WFUNA.org and sign up. It's a free newsletter. It will come to their email address.
It's written really with people in mind who are not following the UN every day, but would like to sort of feel that when they open up our newsletter, they get a real insight into who's there, what they're doing, what civil society is talking about, and what are one of the major topics. We always have a thematic focus in each issue. The most recent one is on the Global Compact and corporate social responsibility, and it's very exciting the way that the UN is now drawing business into a cooperative framework with the UN.
That leads me into my next question. When former Secretary General Kofi Annan came into the UN, he came in with the idea of improving the efficiency and effectiveness of the UN. He implemented a lot of ideas, a lot of positive ideas to improve it. The current Secretary General Ban Ki-moon also has ideas on how to improve the organization. But when you think back to when you first came to the United Nations and where you are today, what are some of the major changes that you see that have taken place within the UN, and also how the UN interacts with policymakers and the general public?
The big one is peacekeeping. It's quite astonishing how over the last 10 years the UN has taken more and more responsibility for peace building, peacekeeping, peacemaking. The budget for that is now over $7 billion, and it's by far the largest component of the UN's work. And I don't think people really understand how brave and courageous all the peacekeepers are. I've got a huge respect for the people who leave their homes and go and serve the cause of peace and security in troubled lands. In fact, they've recently celebrated the 60th anniversary of peacekeeping, and the story is fabulous. And I feel now a duty to work harder to make sure the story is understood by people, because it's a great value. It's a tremendous value that the UN is bringing to the world that I think needs to be better appreciated. The other point I think I'd make is climate change. I do think Ban Ki-moon showed great leadership last year when he saw climate change as the defining issue of his leadership, and he pulled together a consensus in Bali, and he's now moving this agenda forward. Virtually any item that's discussed at the UN, whether it's trafficking in persons or some aspect of development, there is now recognized to be a climate change component, and I think this is terribly important.
And apparently Secretary General Ban Ki-moon was visiting a peacekeeping site, I believe, and the Bali conference on climate change was stalling, was just about to fall apart, and he went over and really got very involved in it and kind of pulled it back together and played a very critical role in putting it back on track and making sure that it came to a fruitful conclusion, which it did. So it kept it going. So that's very, very important to play that role. What do you see as peacekeeping obviously is a major issue, and climate change too, but as we move into the 21st century, what do you see as some of the other issues that will be major issues that the United Nations will deal with or should deal with?
I think the biggest challenge facing the UN in the 21st century is to understand that we need to deal with global issues which transcend national boundaries. The UN on its own can't do it, and that the UN needs to become much better at building partnerships with the private sector and with civil society. there's more and more talk now about such partnerships becoming almost like mega communities of people who identify very clearly what the problem is and work together with strategies for understanding together how they can complement each other to achieve the changes that are needed. And I think that we are heading in that direction, and it's just terribly important that governments who see themselves as the member states of the UN learn how to recognize that while they will be the decision makers at the end of the day, it's enormously valuable to integrate the contributions, the talents, the skills, the resources of both the private sector and civil society in the work of the UN.
That's very important. And of course, as we've learned over the years, the United Nations personnel can do only so much. It's you're talking about the 192 governments that make up the board of directors at the United Nations, the General Assembly at the United Nations, and they're the ones that really have to do the lion's share. They set the policies, they provide the financing, but they must do the lion's share of the work if many of the UN programs are going to be successful. And they have to get involved, and where the UN has been successful, they have been involved, generally speaking. So that's very, very important. Well, the United Nations consists of 192 governments. You're a people's organization. The UN is starting to bring more what we call non-governmental organizations in, such as WFUNA. What are some of the NGOs that you network with, that you liaison with and work on projects with?
Oh, so many. I mean, there are thousands now accredited to.
We can't cover all of those.
No, right.
Just maybe one or two.
One or two. Civicus is a good civil society-based NGO. We've just signed on to a petition that they're taking on the global food crisis. We work with the World Federalists. I'm the first vice president of the Center for UN Reform Education, which does a lot of work on looking at the management issues at the UN and how these can be handled perhaps more effectively and more efficiently. And that's a center based on membership of NGOs. Of course, there's Congo, the Conference of NGOs. We're on the board of Congo. We play an active role in many of their committees. There's so many. There
are so many church groups, virtually every religious group, civic organizations such as Rotary, Lions International, just on across the board. And people can learn more about the World Federation of United Nations Associations by going to www.wfuna.org, or if they want to go directly to the United Nations Association of the USA website, they can go to www.unausa.org and learn much more about these two very important organizations that do impact people's lives in the United States and in many parts of the world. Pera Wells, thank you very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.